Alright, so I was initially going to do this one last year, but then I got caught up in not being able to decide if I wanted to do just two or if I wanted to do like a whole Argento thing. But the quality, at least to me in his later years, is much more up and down than it is in the earlier ones. So I figured we'd just talk about these two and then kind of go on if need be. And I think the main reason I choose these two is that they're probably my two favorites. Because obviously he's obviously most well known for Suspiria, I would say. But Suspiria used to be my favorite of his until I kind of saw these again and again and again down the line, and I kind of ended up feeling like I was taking more away from them as they went on. So at this rate, I'm not even sure if Suspiria would be in my top three of his, with these two and probably Deep Red being that, and then 4 and 5 will probably be Suspiria and Opera, like interchangeable. But there's still a number of great ones apart from those. But these are the ones that really stick out to me. So I figured this is just what I would run with, at least for now. So I think I want to start with the Bird of the Crystal Plumage. Obviously, chronologically, that makes the most sense. And kind of looking at the whole Giallo genre in general is something that's always been really interesting. It's one of those things where I kind of feared it a bit in my more squeamish days, because you just kind of have this, even when you just hear the word, you get a kind of certain image or images in your head that are likely horrific and bloody. But as you get more into the genre and understand it, what's really kind of an underrated aspect of it, or an underappreciated aspect of it, is the sort of mystery element, because I feel like that's the more underrated aspect of like the slasher genre in general, where it's like that's always one of the more fascinating things to me. Not so much like who's going to be killed next and how, but the fact that all these movies, even like the really low budget ones, are the ones that are considered like lesser in the horror genre, and are typically just throwaway movies, especially random ones in like the 80s, when it was like really taking off, like in the kind of post Friday the 13th way, where like every like amateur horror director was trying to do it. And it's, but even so, when you have those franchise ones where you already know, like, you know, who the killer is and what's going on and where they come from and what their motive is, or at some point maybe not, that they have a motive at all. But it's that whole idea of it having like a mystery quality and trying to figure out who it could possibly be, even if there's not always a, you know, particularly logical reason. There was a video of Guillermo del Toro talking about, I want to say it was Deep Red, but he was also kind of saying things about Argento in general. And one of the things he said that really stuck out to me was he described Argento's movies as making, not necessarily making sense logically so much as lyrically, because obviously it's, when you look at Argento's movies, it's much less about the story and more about the execution in more ways than one. But not only that, the very sort of, because obviously there were giallo names before him, like Bava being the, to my understanding, the first one when he did The Girl Who Knew Too Much, which in the U.S. I think is known as like The Evil Eye or something like that. Sort of in the way that Tenebrae in the States is known as Unsane, I think. We're much less creative over here, apparently. So, but going on that, when you talk about it kind of having this, especially Bird with the Crystal Plumage in general, that sort of Hitchcock feel that it goes for quite clearly. And it's really interesting to where you can see a clear, like, you know, Hitchcock influence when you watch this, but then when you watch later movies in the genre, you see Argento, like, all over them. And of course we've got other players in this, like Fulci, and one of the more underappreciated contributors, I think, was Sergio Martino, who did like Torso and All the Colors of the Dark and stuff like that, which is insane. And but these two in particular, I think, really stand out in a way when you talk about the fact that, despite the fact that Bava was kind of the start of it, that Argento has kind of been eventually like the poster child for it, or like the first name that comes to mind if you were to just ask a semi-regular person which director they associate with the genre. I would say more often than not Argento would be the first name that came up, if I had to guess. So going into this one, we immediately start off with a very creepy Ennio Morricone score, and that takes us into this whole setup where, like I said, even though it's not all about the plot, particularly in Argento's case, there's definitely some sort the way he structures his story, where whether it's when it starts off immediately and the twists and turns that he finds along the way. So when you take this moment where we start off, when it's just this dude, this American that's in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place at the right time, depending on how you see the story, to witness this supposed attack from one person to another, being naturally, naturally as an audience and him as a witness, we will think that the person shrouded in black clothes is the perpetrator here, and the seemingly innocent woman that's bleeding currently is the one being attacked. So once he takes that at face value, it turns into this nightmare scenario where he's trapped in between the glass, and it's like he's watching something horrific, but there's literally nothing he can do about it. He can't even go anywhere, and because they're windows, he has really no choice but to witness this happen with nowhere to go. And just that in itself, the fact that that sets up the whole story and already puts us in that kind of mood, it says a lot about when we go into this. And of course, throughout it, we will see stuff that would eventually become his trademarks. Often, like the whole thing of how we see the character's memories of certain events, and the way this plays up in this movie in particular, where it's like we're getting like constant replays of it, and some of it is like zoomed in, and we're like really trying. And it's basically like Antonioni's movie Blow Up, only we're seeing it through the actual perspective of the character's mind, as he kind of looks over this in his head over and over again, which makes it even more intriguing than Blow Up in certain ways. I really love Blow Up, so it's hard to say what's better or worse there. But as far as like Blow Up was an actual like photo evidence that the character was able to study, whereas in this one he's strictly working with the memory. Which is something that we'd see a lot in later Argento movies. But the thing also is that the way that influences other scenes and how we react to them, depending on how you react. But because there's that one moment where after his girlfriend is attacked, and the killer has stabbed through the door or the wall, and there's the hole there that still remains. And later on, there's the scene when it's after this has happened, and they're back together and everything is safe, and then Carlo, his friend, looks through that hole. And in that particular moment, it's kind of hard to tell if we're in the same scene and that is a character that we know is not a threat, or if it's her like having this sudden vivid memory of something. And it's only after watching the full scene play out that we realize exactly what it is. So there are times like that where it can kind of put us on edge, where we're not entirely sure the time frame of what we're looking at and when. So there's that, but also when you look at Argento's style, we can look at all this and we can see how high of a creepy factor there is and how scary a factor things are, and the gore factor that's eventually going to come in. But the thing that really works about Argento, and I think it's really apparent in this one especially, is like the playful nature that he has about what he's working with, where we get stuff like just these really unexpected moments of humor. But as the movie goes on, the less and less unexpected those moments end up being. Where like when he's walking home and he ends up getting attacked and almost killed, and when he goes home and he talks about that, he says, she asks what happened, and he says, "Oh, you know, the usual." And it's just throwaway things like that. The whole scene with the lineup is much more light than you would expect with the rest of the environment. But they also kind of do this where they're able to take those moments that are sort of playful about itself, but they're in moments that are genuinely suspenseful, like when he's being pursued by the assassin. Where another sort of trademark moment we eventually see is this is one of the first instances, I think, of when we see the character in the foreground, and then when he bends out of the frame, there's the person behind him. Only in this particular instance, it's a dead person, so it's not as threatening as it is in other cases, but Tenebrae especially. But when this scene when he's being pursued by this assassin, that's played by Reggie Nalder, whose face might look familiar because I believe he was also an assassin in The Man Who Knew Too Much, the Hitchcock's remake of his own movie, but he's probably much more noticeable as Kurt Barlow. So we know that just that face structure is immediately recognizable, which is really interesting because the fact that the whole movie is sort of shrouding who the main threat is throughout, that it's like really jarring and almost startling when this car pulls up and we know it's an immediate threat and we immediately see a face. Like a face to say this is part of the threat, even though, once again, playing with the memories, later he doesn't quite remember having a clear view of him. But another way this gets a bit playful while also being extremely suspenseful is the moment that's right out of a comedy. When he goes after the guy and he says, I'm looking for a guy wearing this hat and this yellow jacket. The fact that Jala translates to yellow surely is not a coincidence here, by the way. And then when he opens the doors, he first cracks it open thinking the dude is standing right there, because immediately the first thing he sees right by the door is a dude in a yellow jacket, only to reveal it is a room full of these people, these prize fighters that are all wearing the exact same thing. And like I said, that's just the perfect way to blend something extremely suspenseful, while also it's something you would see in any sort of, slapstick comedy or something, or at least a classic comedy. And to be able to do that without really losing the tone, and how the scares and the suspense still hit as hard even after these moments, it just shows, immediately this early into his career how much of a hold he had on that sort of, tone juggling. And that also goes into a lot of the characters here, which is really one of Argento's better traits, I think, because when you talk about the fact that a movie may not always make sense logically, but it's not necessarily about that, it's more about, the environment itself and the atmosphere, and a lot of that is going to involve the different characters that come out of this, especially when we're talking about a mystery where we're trying to find, a guilty party of sorts that's a face we can't identify. So every potentially guilty face that comes in and out of this has got to make their own moments really memorable. And the fact that for a while the movie is basically just a series of this becomes extremely entertaining and engrossing in itself. So we get people like So Long, the pimp that's in the prison that has to say so long, otherwise he'll stutter. And we get that that way comical moment when he says that the first time, and the dude actually starts to get up to leave. It's like that's so absurdly comical for a movie like this that it's kind of perfect in its placement. Where, like I said, the comical stuff does get less and less unexpected as it goes on, as you really start to embrace the different tones that are going on here. But the thing is because both of them become so common, the suspense and the humor, you're never quite sure which one's going to be the next one you're going to get. Whether you're going to get a genuinely suspenseful scene, a genuinely scary scene, or it's going to have some humorous payoff of sorts. Or all of the above. It's hard to tell. There's also Faina, the informant that shows up, that for some reason, completely unexplained reason, and that's what makes it good, that it's completely unexplained, this guy seems to speak and respond in opposites for some reason. If that was explained, I don't remember, but it doesn't need to be explained. That's the beauty of it. And we remember him for that. That's the whole point, that's what we remember about these people. Then we have the artist that has completely barred off his house, so you have to have a ladder to get in through his window in order to get inside, and this dude is fattening up cats and eating them, much to our protagonist's disgust, realizing it's a little too late to take back what is already in your system. And that very relatable moment of him realizing the kind of environment he's in, before he even realizes he's eating cat, and he sneakily wipes his fork off. And it's when you know the extent that this scene goes, makes that little moment even funnier. And that's the thing, the fact that you can come away from movies like this and know the characters even more than the plot itself might seem like something is kind of misplaced, but in a vision like this, where a lot of it is just in the atmosphere of it. That almost makes perfect sense to be able to view it like that. So, and it's like the simplicity of the story is like the simplicity of it is what makes it work. Because it gives all these other things so much room to shine and bring the whole movie to life in various ways, and not just necessarily trying to pull you through one particular plot, but giving you all these different things to chew on, which is really great. And that's not even to mention the cinematography from Vittorio Storaro, who we know he's got 3 Oscars, and he did like Apocalypse Now, and he did a lot of Bartolucci's movies, a lot of Warren Beatty's movies, and he's legendary. And his work here in particular really stands out. And this was also much like Argento. This was really early in his lineup, so like towards the beginning, and we get stuff like probably one of my favorite transitions in any movie ever, when we're dealing with this picture of the woman being stabbed, which is a terrifying image in itself, and I love the way it's utilized throughout. And this, but in particular, this transition we get where we see like the black and white copy of it, and the way we kind of zoom in on it, and then it transitions into the real one, which is in color, and then we realize we're in the killer's apartment. That's got to be one of my favorite transitions in any movie ever. And there's the whole thing where something that we see a lot in Tenebrae also is the idea that whenever we see a blade of sorts, particularly like when it's stabbing through the wall or something like that, it seems like all the blades in this movie have a gleam off of them or a shine on them that like really stands out, even when they're in rooms that are completely dark. Like somehow light finds them and just like illuminates them, and it's just this really sort of ominous, dooming thing, and this where like the oncoming gore and murder and all that stuff just really like literally penetrates the screen practically, which feels crazy. So that's pretty much what I take away from this, is the simplicity is why it works. And it's a case of, I understand that it might maybe lose a bit of that if like a lot of movies were like that, but I do feel like it's something that's missing from a lot of movies. But it suits this particular genre so well that maybe it feels much more like it's only in certain aspects something like that would work as well as it does in these movies. But I don't know. Here I think especially, and like I said, I think that's the one of many draws to the whole slasher genre in general, that mainly came about from sort of basically copying, Jawa movies. So it's like there's almost always something in a sort of classic slasher movie that you can link back to a Jawa movie, whether it be a shot or the way somebody's killed or whatever. So like even the opening of this movie, like the very opening, like with the fact that we're looking through a camera that's taking pictures while that exact score is playing, Tarantino used directly in Death Proof at the airport. And that won't be the last time we mention Tarantino in this video. So that pretty much takes us over to Tenebrae, which, as I said, is known as Unsane in the U.S. for some reason. And before going into this, obviously, one of the first things to mention is that we just lost Dario Nicolodi, which I found out about, like, hours before doing this video, despite how long I've been planning it. That was a weird coincidence, but what sucks about that is, not only is she great, and she was a great and consistent collaborator of Argento's, but, and she's great in Tenebrae also, but there is, she's also gets kind of like, maybe not as much credit as she should, but gets credit for kind of, because obviously she, like, co-wrote Suspiria and stuff like that, but the whole idea of once they sort of got together in that area where they were together as they worked, you can kind of see like a bit of a shift where there's kind of a balance in regards to, because one of the things we go into a lot in Tenebrae is the criticisms that Argento would get about being, misogynistic in the way he would see women as victims and stuff like that. And how there was kind of a, even though it doesn't necessarily mean that's what his movies actually were, but you could sense like a balance of sorts when they were collaborating frequently. That kind of added something kind of new to his movies at the time. So that's definitely plays a big part in why she was so sort of a big part of his filmography in general and his career in general. So it really kind of sucked hearing that and was very surprising. So um, going into the movie itself, we do, yes, immediately start off with a girl being stalked, at the time, a random girl to us in this bookstore. And what's great about this, though, is the fact that it doesn't really hold back. Like, we just sort of start this immediately. We kind of get our introduction by the fire. We see that somebody is obsessed with Peter Neal's books. And then we get a little bit of a Peter Neal introduction, and then get right into the horror aspect and what exactly the killer is going to do. And when we get these shots immediately that put us in the killer's perspective, watching her in the bookstore, and then the precision of these shots when we're going along the shelves and there's like those gaps in between the books that are standing up, and it's like the way he's watching her, and it's just like to immediately put us in that perspective is already kind of startling, and then kind of getting right into it's this, I think it's the whole thing of like, it's sort of like voyeurism and going into that sort of thing where it's like there's something uncomfortably fascinating about being in that particular perspective and watching the victims in that way, sort of like when they did that new version of Maniac, where almost the whole thing was from like the first person perspective. And it's like it's a place that a lot of moviegoers probably don't want to be. So the directors that actually take us there can sometimes take us in the most fascinating directions, because we kind of know we don't want to be there, but there's just the morbid fascination with it that takes us there and gives us the kind of thrill watching the way movies like this are shot, or scenes like this are shot. And that's not the only, like, that's just a small fraction of the sort of visuals that we get throughout this movie. Like, this, if I remember correctly, is often known as one of Argento's more visually satisfying, and that's already a pretty high bar. But going into this, one of the most famous takes that Argento ever did, obviously, or has ever done, is this crane shot, this long take outside of the lesbian's house, where we kind of get a little bit of taste of it at first, of the idea of a long take, when it's when Tilda comes home, and Marianne's already here with some dude that she's picked up, and we get this long shot for a little bit that's not very mobile. The camera just kind of stays in place a couple of times when she comes in, and then we see like Marianne on the steps, and then they have like a full conversation, and then Tilda goes and gets like scissors or something. And it feels like it stays on this for a while, and then we get the really long shot. I think it's like 2.5 minutes or something. And it's just this crane shot of kind of the whole house, where we see all the places in which... apparently some people criticized it for being pointless and not really showing anything, and they were like desperately tried to get him to cut it. But I felt like it was pretty clear that, especially with just the creepy nature of it in general, and like that voyeuristic quality we were talking about, where it's like, they do seem pretty secure in this house, so then when the camera is showing us like every single outside area of the house, it's like you can see all the different places that are like vulnerable, and how and like I said, it's not quite a perspective shot, but it might as well be. And it really just sets this really uneasy tone that, like, even in the security of your house, just how much security is that really? Like I said, all these places our minds don't want to go, but movies like this just take us there in this really morbidly fascinating way. So, the thing about this also, and I'm trying to get into this without it sounding, like, pretentious, because I think Argento is far from pretentious. I'm just trying to not sound pretentious in what I'm in how I'm describing it. Um, the basically the way art is used in this, like the way it's portrayed and how it's utilized in regards of like like obviously Peter Neal's art, who is Anthony Franciosa's character, and as we start off, we get that opening shot where we realize that the killer is influenced by his books and his style of writing and the sort of aggressive nature of them as he is confronted by Tilda, I think, earlier, that lays out the whole thing of these are all the things that make you this really, sadistic writer or whatever. And these books being his art, like what he creates, like how he takes what's deep, deep inside him and is able to put it out onto the pages, which likely, as more things unravel, we realize is probably what was keeping him from actually doing it himself for as long as that lasted. So when you go into this and you hear like it's basically Argento approaching his own art. Like say he's looking at it from like Peter Neal's perspective. Like Peter Neal is basically like some sort of vague incarnation of him, or not so vague, depending. And so we immediately start off with him being confronted by critics about the content of his stuff and basically making judgments about him as a person and his mindset in regards to what happens to which people in these stories. And there's something about that where it's because we've seen like artists before respond to critics by making another project, and more often than not, it kind of feels like the artist is throwing a tantrum, and it's and it feels like it sort of has like this sort of bitter, petty quality to it when they do that. But when you look at this movie and take it from that perspective, it doesn't feel like that so much as it feels like, and maybe this is being familiar with Argento's other stuff, but it doesn't really feel like you could say like the character of Hilda is like a really successful troll by him to his critics, or you could say maybe it's some sort of like genuine reaction to it, or like maybe trying to explain himself or something. Or you could also take it as, and I think this is the more likely one, at least to me, which is he takes those criticisms and instead of wanting to fight it, kind of uses it as inspiration and wants to add it to his art in the way that it already is. And sort of make something maybe newer and fresher out of it. Like maybe it was invigorating getting criticisms like that to help like build off of his art already. Which seems more likely to me. And then there's the whole thing of the fact that, like, say Peter Neal is a vague incarnation of him, or not so vague, and the fact that Peter Neal ends up being, at the end of the day, the killer, or at least a killer. And that's one of those things where, like I said, if it was anybody else, I would think that would be alarming. But the thing is I feel like that's going back to Argento being playful with it. Like it's showing that he can. I mean, not only is it an amazing twist, by the way, but the fact that it does feel like he's kind of having a laugh with this whole thing about bringing the actual criticisms from his actual work into the movie. It definitely kind of has the aura of just him having a laugh about like that's what it ends up being. And so, but talking about that though, about it being a twist in itself, is that we were talking about how sort of, simplistic the storylines in these movies can be. So when you look at the movie before before the big moment in the middle, or towards the end of the middle, or whatever you want to call it, where Birdie, who is the first portion of the movie's killer, is killed off. And it's like before that happens, this is a pretty by the book, like slasher kind of thing. So the fact that he throws this wrench into it by doing the unthinkable, by having, like, if there's one thing you don't expect to happen when you're watching a slasher movie, it's for the killer to be one of the people that's killed off before it's over, by another mystery person. And so that in itself is like, that up there is like, is up there with Marion Crane being killed off, in regards to this holy shit, what the fuck turn a movie takes in its middle, or somewhere in the middle. And the thing about that is it does seem really out there, but the fact that it adds up so perfectly is what makes it work so well. Because it could just be, like in another movie I could feel like it would be, or especially like a more mainstream movie, like a movie in the US or something. If it tried this would be feel like just sort of a cheap way to try to get the biggest twist possible without necessarily trying to make it logical. And even though we've talked about the whole thing that Del Toro said about it's much more about lyrical than logical, the way that comes into play here also, where like the lyrical way about it actually kind of ends up making it logical in a way, because there's the whole sort of symmetry factor to this movie, where it's like and it's becomes clear quickly that that whole symmetry angle is not an accident. So it gets really specific in like the individual moments throughout the second half that are kind of echoing little moments or bigger moments from the first half of it. And so with this, it's almost like the shocking turn, or the supposedly shocking turn, was like being blueprinted to us the whole time. And so it's like this whole thing of it kind of being one side kind of mirrors the other in its entirety. And then there's so many, like you can read so much into this that would make this video like 2 more hours. But there's one thing in particular that I wanted to kind of illustrate this with, which is the sort of flashbacks that we have. The flashbacks that almost feel like they're like in this. It's almost like a fetishistic version of like like a Fellini scene or something. When he's having these flashbacks of his childhood, we're assuming they're Peter Neal's flashbacks, where he's on the beach and there's this confrontation with this woman who humiliates him, and then eventually there's the whole thing where he gets revenge by murdering her. So the thing about this that was really interesting is when you look at it from the perspective of the chain reaction that comes from this, where we have and how this event started off two different paths of murder and carnage. Because we have this particular moment which led to her being murdered by him, and so inevitably this in turn is going to turn into what he puts into his work and puts into his books. And so as we're saying, it's like he can almost kind of like, you know, like stave off the urges to kill by putting it in his work, and then his work is discovered by Birdie, and then influenced by this, Birdie starts off his own killing spree, and when Birdie starts his killing spree, it has now triggered Peter Neal to go back to those urges, and it starts all over again. So it's like this whole sort of chain reaction that brings us all the way back around to Peter Neal being a murderer. And it's stuff like that is what really makes this kind of a sickly, beautiful thing. And then eventually we get to our big ending when the murders are much more, I guess, passionate, I guess you could say. Now they're axe murders instead of just like, you know, razors and being killed. And of course we've had our sort of slasher build up to this. With like we start off with characters we've never seen before getting killed, and then more and more major characters start getting killed, all the way up to John Saxon and the cops, and so on, until we get to our big moment. And Jane in particular is one of these, and this I feel like is when the movie really hits a big moment. And I remember reading a while back, I believe Tarantino called this his favorite death scene in any movie ever, which, coming from him specifically, is a pretty big statement. And immediately, like I said, you can see the influence. And sometimes, you know, maybe taking directly. So there's many ways in which this scene is insane, with the unexpected nature of it, of the fact that she is killed and killed in the fashion that she's killed in. But the thing is even though these movies are known for like their gore and their shocking kill scenes and all that, there hasn't really been like a shitload of blood. Like I said, it's kind of much more startling in like just kind of what's happening and like the visceral nature of the scenes themselves. But like the presence of blood itself feels like it's been pretty sparse when we actually see it. So it's about as unexpected as it gets when Jane loses her arm to this axe and there's just a fountain all over the walls. It feels like it comes from out of nowhere. In the best way. Like, that's a compliment. In how startling and sudden and vicious it feels. And the fact that that's how we enter the climax is like talk about setting a tone. Um, and then obviously leading to the shocking deaths of the cops and the reveals and all that. Like I said, we get that shot that has also been... I talked about it being in the Birth of the Crystal Plumage when we reveal Reggie Noller's body, but then there's also a very notable example of this, even though many people have taken it, is the very last shot of Raising Cain, De Palma's movie. And of course, De Palma is known for taking stuff directly, almost more blatantly than even Tarantino. Where it's like you can, especially Hitchcock, De Palma loves his Hitchcock shots, and you can spot them from a million miles away. And the same thing for this shot. This most notable, I think, in Tenebrae, where the cop kind of ducks down or bends down, and Neil's like right there. And it's like almost every shot in this movie feels like legendary and borrowed and taken and all that. And of course, naturally, we get to the point where we talk about the use of art in the movie and how it kind of set off this whole chain of events. And naturally, of course, he is done in by a piece of art. So, call it on the nose if you want to, but I feel like just, like, the whole execution in general, it just works for me. So, like, these kind of movies that aren't even really hiding it can be as on the nose as they want to be, and, like, the more the better. Because you know they're just indulging in it at that point. And that's just really what the whole thing kind of feels like anyway, so it's perfect. It's just perfectly suited. And there is a feeling in particular I get from Argento movies. I've noticed that it's mostly Argento movies. Like, I can't think of another specific director that gives me this feeling or gave me this feeling so consistently. Unfortunately, I can't have that feeling more than once, but it's the idea of... I don't know how instantaneous a lot of people react to Argento, but with him, I've always gotten this thing where it's like obviously, there's so many things, like I said, to kind of chew on, and there's so many things that your eyes are on. Whether it be, like, you know, studying the themes of it, or the shocking gore and the shocking kill scenes, or the bizarre additions, like the different characters and where they're coming from and what weird quirk they have or whatever, or their place in the story. There's all the really, you know, creative shots that, you know, would start whole trends, or directors have been taking, or there'll be shots that you recognize other directors have taken, and it'll be like, oh, I remember when this director did that shot, and he must have taken it from this. And it's like, there's so much of that there's really, you're so occupied with all that stuff, you don't really have time to realize, you don't really have enough time to have that moment that you usually have during a great movie when it occurs to you that you're watching something great. So it's not till the very end. And so it's like, and I feel like Tenebrae was one of the stronger instances of this. And Deep Red for sure as well, where I really wasn't thinking about how I felt about the movie, and then the second, like literally the second the credits start rolling, is when I'm like, that was something great. And it's like, I hate that I can only see his movies for the first time once. Because I've really missed that feeling. But it's so vivid in my memory from the first time I saw these. And it's... yeah, so I feel like... I've always kind of taken to... like, The Bird of Crystal Plumage was one of the first Argento movies that I really, like, took to and made me really interested in seeing the rest of his stuff. Like, even more so than Suspiria. But I feel like I had more of a, like, actual visceral reaction to Tenebrae when I watch it. Because it's still, even though it's not going to be as potent, that feeling, as it was the first time I saw it, and not knowing it was going to end right on that moment. It's, there's a certain power that definitely is still there with every time. So... but both of these are... that's the great thing about Argento also, is the rewatchability of these movies. It's like you can watch these so many times, and because they've got so much working in there, it's like I said, and all this great stuff that you can analyze and go into is hiding behind, like, the simplest of storylines. It just keeps making you want to come back to them. So... now that and now I'm like really hyped to like rewatch Deep Red now. Now that I've talked about these two. So it's one of those cases where you can never, like, Dario Argento's movies are like eating chips. Like, you can't just have one of them. Like, if you watch one, it turns into a marathon. So that's pretty much how I feel about him in general, and how I feel about these two movies. So this October thing at the very end of November is going to finally end once I do the 9 Hammer Dracula movies. And then we're going to have a whole string of just kind of one-off reviews to fill in all those blanks in November, just in really quick succession. And I'm also going to touch on Season 4 of Fargo, one episode at a time. So that'll be what November is really quick. And then December, we'll pick back up and kind of get normal again and have awards videos and stuff like that. So, and a few videos with my brother will be thrown in there also. So until those, I think that's it for this.